we're going to talk about a little bit of California ancient history. Now, I've talked a lot on this program about, well, maybe not a lot, but I've mentioned on this program before that in California, Medi-Cal pays for abortions, and it pays for abortions in this very particular, really lousy fashion. At the federal level, the federal government cannot pay directly for abortion except in cases of, I think, rape, incest, and certain other very rare instances. And that's because of this thing called the Hyde Amendment. The Hyde Amendment is this rider that gets attached to the federal budget every year, and it prohibits, every single year, it prohibits federal taxpayer dollars from federal health care programs to pay for abortion directly. Now, there are a lot of ways in which abortion is subsidized indirectly by the federal government. Medicaid reimburses most of Planned Parenthood's non-abortion services, for example, and money is fungible, but Medicaid will not directly reimburse Planned Parenthood for an abortion. So that's the federal policy, but at the state level in California, that is not the case. At the state level in California, Medi-Cal will pay for abortion because the state of California set up a separate stream of purely California dollars, your taxpayer dollars, to pay for it. So I knew that was the case, but I didn't know why that was. I didn't know the whole story behind it. So recently I thought about this, and I thought, what is the story? So I tried to research it, and I found the answer. So helpfully, the ACLU of Northern California has the whole history of this. This is an article that ACLU of Northern California published on October 20th of 2017. It's called The California Fight for Abortion Access for All, #ACLU Time Machine. This story is accompanied by an old newspaper clipping from 1981, and then a GIF of the old Wonder Woman TV show. This is a GIF of, Jonathan, you can describe this GIF for our radio audience.
So I see, I don't know if this was actually a real thing or if it is Photoshopped.
I believe it's Photoshopped.
It's a glass window with the word patriarchy on it.
And Wonder Woman is smashing it.
I cannot remember for the life of me what her name is.
Yeah, the old Wonder Woman from like
the original Wonder Woman,
the 70s or whatever. So anyway, the one who would spin around in circles and become Wonder Woman. Anyway.
Yes.
All right. So here's the story. The president is attempting to wrest birth control from millions of Americans, blah, 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 blah. Okay, let's get through the history.
Linda Carter, the
old Linda Carter Wonder Woman.
Yes.
There we go. So let's get into the meat of the story. In the late 1970s, the ACLU writes, or Bethany Woolman writing for the ACLU, in the late 1970s, abortion rights and abortion access were under attack nationwide. After being legalized for all 40 weeks of pregnancy and for any reason overnight. The recent Roe v. Wade ruling had benefited all Americans by drastically lowering the rates of unsafe and self-performed abortions. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Get through your propaganda. Nevertheless, a conservative Congress, it was not a conservative Congress. Get the bleep out of here. That was a post-Watergate Congress. That was like a post-Watergate Congress. The Democrats had enormous majorities in both houses.
Which year are they talking about there?
1976.
Oh, you mean right around the time that the Equal Rights Amendment was
almost passed? That Jimmy Carter got elected?
Yeah.
Anyway, a conservative Congress responded.
Noted pro-life activist Betty Ford was the first lady.
Yeah. A conservative Congress responded by passing the Hyde Amendment in 1976, which blocked access to abortion for poor people who relied on federally funded health care. No, it just cut off federal funding for abortion through federal health care programs. That's it. The Hyde Amendment had and still has a disproportionate and pernicious impact on people of color. Okay, yada, yada, yada. All right. Back to the 1970s. Despite Congress's decision to pass the Hyde Amendment, California's Medi-Cal program, funded by state funds, still covered abortion. This was relatively uncontroversial at the time. She says this, but now watch the immediate next sentence. But in 1978, the California legislature voted to essentially defund abortion coverage statewide. So it was so uncontroversial that immediately the California state legislature tried to imitate what the feds were doing with the Hyde Amendment. Uncontroversial that it immediately became the focus of tons of controversy. In 1978, the California legislature voted to essentially defund abortion coverage statewide. The budgetary decision would have cut off abortion care access for over 95% of poor Californians, blah, 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 and would have affected 100,000 teens and poor women each year. So the ACLU and our allies got to work. ACLU of Northern California staff attorney Maggie Crosby filed a lawsuit on behalf of a number of plaintiffs, including a California reproductive rights organization now known as Access, community clinics serving Medi-Cal patients, welfare rights organizations, medical providers, the Communist Party. I'm just kidding. I threw that in. And women's rights groups. The legal team had no way of knowing that their work would become a 12-year battle to maintain medical funding for poor women's abortions. Crosby argued it was unconstitutional. We'll get back to that word. And discriminatory for the government to use state funds to coerce poor pregnant women into childbirth over abortion. Let me translate that for you. Crosby argued that it violated the California state constitution and was discriminatory for the government to stop funding this particular service.
No, John, it says they were coercing the women.
She's using state funds to coerce poor pregnant women into childbirth. No. We were just not paying for her abortion.
No, but if you went in for the abortion, they would abduct you and chain you to a bed until you delivered.
You delivered.
That's what the coercion was,
yes,
right?
Even if you were only 10 weeks pregnant, they would chain you to a bed for 30 weeks.
Okay. Yeah.
No, that was not what was happening. The California Supreme Court agreed. Yeah, the California Supreme Court, which was probably at the time stacked with like 9 former ACLU attorneys. I don't even know that the California Supreme Court has 9 seats. I think it's only 7. In 1981, the court handed down a decision that read, in part, quote, once the state furnishes medical care to poor women in general, it cannot withdraw part of that care solely because a woman exercises her constitutional right to have an abortion. So, for 9 years, the legislature rebelled against the Supreme Court ruling, good for them, and attempted to cut abortion funding from the budget every summer. But every year for 9 years, Crosby would work through the 4th of July weekend in order to challenge the illegal funding cuts in court. Every year she prevailed. The budget cuts never took place because of the orders issued in these cases, and Medi-Cal still covers abortion care in California to this day. And they lived happily ever after. So the history of why we fund Medi-Cal, why we fund abortion via Medi-Cal, is very simple. There was no vote. You were not consulted. The people of California were not consulted. There was no ballot initiative. There was no vote in the state legislature. The governor never signed a bill. He never vetoed a bill. By default, Medi-Cal was paying for health care services generally, prenatal health care services generally, and Medi-Cal started paying for abortion. The California Supreme Court decided for us based on their interpretation of the California Constitution. And in fairness, the California Constitution is kind of screwy, but they were reading things into the California Constitution that were not there. California's state Supreme Court decided for us in an act of judicial supremacy that would make Ruth Bader Ginsburg blush that no, you can't, once you start paying for a service, you can't withdraw that service because a person is exercising their constitutional right. So I'm sorry, if Medi-Cal makes the mistake of paying for elective nose jobs and then decides to withdraw paying for that, this California Supreme Court apparently will say, no, you have a constitutional right to have a free nose, to have a nose job. And that's true, you do have a right to have a nose job. But you don't have a right to have the state pay for it. That's the point. But when it comes to abortion, all legal reasoning goes out the window. Anyway, that is the history of why your state taxpayer dollars pay for abortion. All right, we'll talk about this more after the break. You're listening to Right to Life Radio with John Girardi and Jonathan Keller. We're going to talk about SB 24. Its first hearing is coming up.